The hardest person to fool is the one who has already survived heartbreak. No one in the quiet corner of Maple and Ash Cafe knew that the woman crying softly beside the rain-speckled window controlled a company worth billions of dollars. And even fewer would have guessed that the tired man walking through the front door in worn work boots carried a kind of wealth money could never buy. Ethan Brooks paused just inside the entrance, brushing the cool November air from his denim jacket before glancing around the crowded dining room. He almost turned back. Blind dates had never been his idea. At 39, life revolved around early mornings at Brooks Auto Repair, late-night homework with his 9-year-old daughter Lily, and making sure there was enough left each month to keep the lights on in their small Ohio home. Romance belonged to another version of himself, the one who had laughed more before losing his wife 5 years earlier. His best friend had insisted this dinner might be different, promising that the woman was kind, intelligent, and just as reluctant to be there as he was. Ethan checked the handwritten note folded inside his wallet. Table 7, 7 o'clock. Her name is Victoria. He smiled nervously and walked deeper into the cafe, the warm scent of roasted coffee blending with fresh cinnamon rolls while quiet jazz drifted from hidden speakers overhead. Couples laughed softly beneath amber pendant lights. Waiters moved gracefully between tables, and outside, rain painted silver lines across the darkening streets. Everything felt ordinary until he noticed the woman sitting alone at table 7. She wasn't scrolling through her phone. She wasn't checking the time. She wasn't pretending to be busy. She was crying. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silent tears slipping down her cheeks while both hands gripped a folded white napkin as though it were the only thing keeping her together. Ethan stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to interrupt. She looked elegant without trying to be, dressed in a simple navy sweater beneath a tailored wool coat, her blonde hair loosely gathered behind her shoulders. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing that hinted at private jets, skyscrapers, or magazine covers. She looked like someone carrying too much weight alone. He quietly approached the table and gently placed a fresh napkin beside her untouched cup of tea. "I figured this one might be softer," he said with an awkward smile. Victoria Sterling looked up, surprised. Her blue eyes shimmered with embarrassment as she quickly brushed away another tear. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You must be Ethan." He nodded and pulled out the chair across from her. "Only if you're Victoria." She managed the faintest smile before lowering her gaze again. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was careful, almost respectful, like two strangers standing outside doors they weren't sure they were ready to open. Finally, Victoria inhaled slowly, staring into the cooling tea between her hands. "Before we order," she said quietly, her voice trembling just enough to betray the courage it took to continue, "there's something you should know." Ethan leaned forward, not because he expected a confession, but because something in her expression reminded him of his own reflection on lonely nights after Lily had fallen asleep. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief moment before whispering the words that seemed to carry years of invisible wounds. "Every man I've ever trusted fell in love with my success long before he ever cared about me. And tonight, I almost didn't come because I couldn't bear watching it happen one more time." Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug the waiter had just placed in front of him, letting the heat settle into his calloused fingers as he searched for words that deserved to be spoken. The rain continued tapping gently against the cafe windows while conversations around them blended into a quiet murmur, as though the rest of the room had faded into the background. He looked at Victoria with calm eyes that had learned long ago not to rush another person's pain. "That sounds exhausting," he said softly. She let out a small, almost embarrassed laugh that carried no joy. "It is." She stared toward the window again. "At first, they admire the company. Then they admire the house. Then they admire the cars. Eventually, they convince themselves they admire me." Ethan nodded once. "And by then you already know the difference." She looked back at him, surprised by how quickly he understood. Exactly. For the first time since he had arrived, she noticed that he was not asking questions about her career, her income, or where she lived. He had not even asked what company she worked for. Every other blind date she had ever endured had reached those questions within 5 minutes. Ethan simply listened. He had spent years discovering that sometimes listening was the greatest kindness a person could offer. He remembered sitting beside Lily after nightmares, saying almost nothing while she slowly found the courage to speak. Some hurts could not be repaired with advice. They simply needed someone willing to stay. Victoria folded the damp napkin carefully instead of throwing it away. "I probably sound ridiculous," she admitted. "Most people would say, I have everything." Ethan smiled gently. "People used to tell me that because I had a healthy little girl, I should stop grieving my wife. They meant well. But blessings do not erase losses." Her eyes softened. "You were married?" "For 11 years. He glanced down for a brief moment before looking back at her. "Emily was the best person I ever knew. Cancer took her much faster than any of us expected." Victoria lowered her head. "I am so sorry." Ethan shrugged with quiet acceptance rather than bitterness. Life does not ask whether we are ready. Another silence settled between them, but this one felt different. It was no longer built from awkwardness. It was built from understanding. The waiter approached with menus, but neither of them opened them right away. Victoria traced the edge of the menu with one finger before asking carefully, "Do you ever think about dating because you are lonely or because your daughter deserves someone?" Ethan smiled, thinking of Lily's endless optimism. "My daughter keeps telling me that every good story deserves another chapter. I am just not sure every chapter has to begin the way people expect." Victoria laughed, quietly, and this time the smile reached her eyes. It had been months since laughter had come so naturally. She noticed the faded wedding band mark still visible on Ethan's left hand, even though the ring itself was gone. He noticed nothing except that she seemed to be breathing a little easier. Across the room, a television above the coffee bar briefly switched to a business news channel with the volume muted. The screen flashed images of stock markets and corporate headquarters before showing the familiar silhouette of a celebrated female executive accepting an award. Ethan never looked up. He was too focused on the woman sitting across from him, the one who no longer seemed like a stranger hiding behind tears, but simply another human being hoping that somewhere in the world there was still one person capable of seeing her heart before everything else. The menus remained unopened as the conversation drifted away from careful introductions and toward the quiet corners of their lives that most people never reached on a first meeting. Outside, the rain eased into a gentle mist, leaving tiny diamonds of water across the cafe windows while passing headlights painted slow ribbons of gold through the glass. Ethan finally chuckled when Victoria admitted she had not cooked a proper dinner in nearly 3 months. "That bad?" he asked. She smiled with genuine embarrassment. "Last week I managed to burn grilled cheese." Ethan laughed softly. "Now, that is impressive." She lifted one eyebrow. "You are making fun of me." "Only a little." His smile was warm rather than teasing. "My daughter would probably offer you free lessons." Victoria leaned back for the first time that evening, feeling some invisible weight lift from her shoulders. "How old is she?" "9. Her name is Lily." His entire expression changed the moment he spoke his daughter's name. His eyes brightened with quiet pride, and Victoria noticed how naturally kindness seemed to live inside him. "She loves drawing animals," he continued. "Every refrigerator in our house has disappeared behind her artwork. I keep telling her we should buy another refrigerator instead of taking the pictures down." Victoria laughed. Again, this time without restraint. Several nearby guests glanced over, smiling simply because laughter had become contagious. "She sounds wonderful," Victoria said. "She is." Ethan nodded. "She keeps reminding me that happiness is usually smaller than people expect. Pancakes on Saturday morning, watching snow fall, fixing bicycles together. She says those are the important things." Victoria lowered her eyes for a moment. She could not remember the last time someone had spoken about life without mentioning profits, deadlines, or investments. She had spent years surrounded by polished conference rooms where every conversation carried a hidden agenda. Across the table sat a man whose greatest accomplishment, at least in his own mind, was making blueberry pancakes that did not stick to the pan. Somehow that felt extraordinary. "What about you?" Ethan asked gently. When you are not working, what makes you happy? The question caught her completely off guard. She searched for an answer that should have come easily, but did not. I honestly do not know anymore, she admitted. I used to paint watercolor landscapes with my grandmother when I was a little girl. We would spend entire afternoons beside lakes and old barns. After she passed away, I stopped painting. Then work became everything. Ethan listened without interrupting. Maybe the painting did not disappear, he said quietly. Maybe it is just waiting until life becomes quiet enough for you to hear it again. Victoria stared at him. Nobody had ever described healing that way. It was neither dramatic nor impossible. It sounded gentle, patient, almost hopeful. Before she could answer, the front door opened and a sharply dressed man in an expensive charcoal suit hurried inside, shaking rain from his umbrella. His eyes swept across the dining room until they landed on table 7. His expression changed instantly from urgency to visible relief. He walked toward them with quick, confident steps. "Miss Sterling," he said before stopping himself. "I have been trying to reach you for nearly an hour. The board members are waiting for your decision." Victoria's smile disappeared. Ethan blinked, confused by the formal greeting. The man seemed to realize too late what he had revealed, but the silence had already settled over the table like the first snowfall of winter. Ethan looked from the stranger to Victoria, noticing the apology already forming in her eyes, and for the first time that evening he realized the woman sitting across from him had been carrying far more than a broken heart. The man immediately lowered his voice, realizing his mistake, but the words had already settled between the three of them. Victoria closed her eyes for a brief second before looking back at Ethan with quiet regret. "Thank you, Daniel," she said calmly. "Please tell the board they will have my answer later tonight." Daniel hesitated. "They said it cannot wait." Victoria's expression remained composed, but there was a firmness in her voice that left no room for argument. "It will have to." He nodded respectfully before leaving as quickly as he had arrived, disappearing into the damp evening beyond the cafe door. Neither Ethan nor Victoria spoke for several long moments. The soft jazz continued drifting through the room. Dishes clinked gently somewhere behind the counter, and the aroma of fresh coffee still filled the air, yet everything somehow felt different. Ethan finally glanced toward the muted television above the coffee bar. The business news segment had returned. A photograph of Victoria appeared beside a headline announcing another record-breaking quarter for Sterling Dynamics. Employees walking past the television barely noticed, but Ethan quietly connected every piece at once. The tailored coat, the careful answers, the sadness hidden behind practiced smiles. She had never lied to him, but she had not told him the whole truth either. Victoria followed his eyes to the television and released a slow breath. "I was hoping you would get to know me before you learned that part." Ethan looked back at her. There was no anger in his face, only surprise mixed with disappointment that life had once again become more complicated than it needed to be. "You are the chief executive officer." She nodded. "Yes." "The Sterling Dynamics?" Another quiet nod. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. "I have seen your company name on delivery trucks." Victoria gave a faint smile. "Most people recognize the company before they recognize me." Ethan folded his hands together, searching for the right response. "I understand now why you asked what you asked earlier." She looked at him carefully. "Do you? Every person you meet already knows who you are." He paused before continuing. "Tonight, I did not." Victoria swallowed hard. "That was the first peaceful conversation I have had in years." Ethan lowered his eyes toward the coffee that had long since grown cold. He remembered arriving worried about whether he could afford dessert if Lily needed new sneakers the following week. Across from him sat a woman whose world operated on numbers so large they no longer seemed real. The distance between them suddenly felt wider than any highway in America. Victoria noticed the subtle change in his posture. It was small enough that almost anyone else would have missed it, but she had spent years watching people change the instant they discovered her identity. Some became overly charming. Others became intimidated. Ethan simply became quieter. That silence hurt her more than either reaction. "Please say something," she whispered. Ethan lifted his eyes with the same kindness that had comforted her all evening. You deserve to tell your story your own way. He offered a gentle smile that barely reached his tired eyes. I just wish life had given us another hour before reality walked through that door. Victoria felt her heart tighten. She realized she wanted him to stay, not because he admired her success, but because for one beautiful hour he had completely ignored it. Ethan slowly reached for his jacket, not in anger, but in quiet acceptance. I think I should go, he said softly. Not because of who you are. He hesitated before adding the words that broke the fragile calm between them. Because I am afraid that once the world catches up to this table, it will never leave us alone. Victoria watched Ethan slide his chair back with the same quiet dignity he had carried through every moment of the evening. There was no bitterness in his face, no accusation, and somehow that made the distance between them feel even greater. She reached across the table before he could stand completely, resting her fingertips lightly against the edge of his sleeve. Please, she said softly, do not leave because of my job. Ethan paused, his hand still holding the back of the chair. He looked at her, not with fear, but with the sadness of a man who had spent years protecting the small, peaceful life he had rebuilt one careful day at a time. It is not your job, he answered. It is everything that comes with it. Victoria slowly withdrew her hand, giving him the space he deserved. You think my world will destroy yours? Ethan smiled gently. No, I think your world will try. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the sidewalks shimmering beneath rows of streetlights. Inside the cafe, the evening crowd continued chatting, unaware that two strangers sat at a table where neither fortune nor poverty mattered as much as the invisible walls life had built around them. Victoria lowered her eyes to the untouched dinner that had finally arrived only minutes earlier. Neither of them had taken more than a few bites. Do you know why I agreed to this blind date? She asked quietly. Ethan remained standing, but he listened. Because for once my assistant promised nobody would know my name before meeting me. She said maybe that would give me one honest evening. Her voice grew softer. You gave me exactly that. Ethan looked toward the window, watching reflections of passing cars ripple across the wet pavement. And then your assistant found you. She shook her head. Daniel is my chief legal officer. Ethan let out a small laugh, despite himself. That probably explains why he looked worried enough to rewrite the Constitution. Even Victoria smiled at that. The laughter faded almost as quickly as it had arrived. Ethan slipped his jacket over his shoulders. Victoria, I wake up at 5 every morning. I fix transmissions, replace brake pads, and spend my evenings helping Lily with 4th grade math. On Saturdays, we shop for groceries with coupons clipped from the newspaper because every dollar matters. There is nothing wrong with my life. It is simple, and I love it. She nodded slowly. I never thought there was anything wrong with it. I know. He hesitated before continuing. But tomorrow reporters could be parked outside my garage. People might follow my daughter to school because someone decided a billionaire had dinner with a mechanic. His voice remained calm, yet every word carried the quiet weight of a father thinking first about his child. Lily already lost her mother. I promised myself I would never let unnecessary chaos become part of her childhood. Victoria felt tears gathering again, but this time she did not hide them. She understood that he was not rejecting her. He was protecting the person he loved most. You really are different, she whispered. Ethan frowned gently. Different how? She smiled through the sadness. Every other man wanted to become part of my world before he even knew me. You're walking away from it because you love someone else more than yourself. Ethan looked down, humbled by the words. That is what parents do. He reached into his wallet and quietly placed enough cash on the table to cover his share of the meal, despite knowing she could have purchased the entire restaurant without noticing the expense. It was not about money. It was about respect. Victoria watched him with a heart that suddenly understood something she had spent years searching for. For the first time in her life, the only man who had seen her heart before her fortune was also the first man willing to leave it untouched rather than risk hurting the little girl waiting for him at home. The cold night air greeted Ethan as he stepped outside, and for a long moment he simply stood beneath the cafe awning, listening to the gentle rhythm of water dripping from the roof onto the sidewalk below. He took one slow breath before walking toward his aging pickup truck parked beneath a flickering street lamp. Behind him, Victoria remained seated at table 7, watching through the rain-speckled glass until the red taillights disappeared around the corner. She did not call after him. Deep inside, she knew that if she truly respected the man she had just met, she also had to respect the reason he walked away. Nearly 40 minutes later, Victoria entered the top-floor boardroom of Sterling Dynamics. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing skyline, while directors surrounded a polished walnut table covered with financial reports and digital tablets. They immediately began discussing acquisitions, market forecasts, and quarterly projections, but their voices seemed strangely distant. Numbers that once demanded her complete attention now blurred together without meaning. During a pause in a meeting, one director smiled confidently and said, "Congratulations on another historic quarter. You have everything any executive could ever want." Victoria forced a polite smile, but the words echoed painfully inside her heart. Everything. She remembered Ethan talking about blueberry pancakes, refrigerator drawings, and Saturday mornings with Lily. Somehow those simple memories carried more warmth than every trophy displayed in the executive hallway outside. "Miss Sterling?" another director asked. "Are you all right?" She blinked and quietly closed the report in front of her. "Yes," she answered. "Please continue." Yet she knew she had not heard a single presentation during the previous 20 minutes. Later that evening, after the meeting finally ended, Victoria stood alone inside her spacious penthouse overlooking the city. The elegant rooms were perfectly designed, perfectly decorated, and perfectly silent. She removed her heels, walked barefoot across the hardwood floor, and stopped before a large bookshelf where dozens of framed business awards reflected the soft light of the fireplace. Beside them rested one faded watercolor painting of an old red barn beside a quiet lake. She had painted it with her grandmother when she was 12 years old. She gently lifted the frame, brushing away a thin layer of dust with her fingertips. Ethan's words returned almost like a whisper carried by memory. Maybe the painting did not disappear. Maybe it is just waiting until life becomes quiet enough for you to hear it again. A tear slipped down her cheek before she realized she was crying again. Across town, Ethan unlocked the front door of his modest home just as Lily hurried down the hallway wearing fuzzy socks and carrying a sketchbook almost as large as her chest. "Daddy," she exclaimed, "you were late." Ethan smiled wearily as she wrapped her arms around him. "I know. I am sorry." She studied his face with the remarkable honesty only children possess. "Did your dinner go okay?" Ethan hesitated before hanging his jacket on the familiar wooden hook beside the door. "It was different." Lily tilted her head. "Different good or different bad?" He laughed softly. "I have not figured that out yet." She accepted the answer without another question and proudly opened her sketchbook. Inside was a colorful drawing of 3 people standing beneath a bright blue sky, all holding hands while a golden retriever wagged its tail beside them. Ethan noticed only 2 faces resembled people he knew. "Who was the lady?" he asked gently. Lily shrugged with innocent confidence. "I do not know yet. I just thought maybe someday somebody nice will help make our family a little bigger." Ethan looked quietly at the drawing, feeling both hope and sorrow settle together inside his heart, completely unaware that only a few miles away, the woman he believed belonged to another world had already made one life-changing decision. She was not going to let the kindest man she had met disappear without first proving that she was willing to step into his world instead of asking him to enter hers. Saturday morning arrived beneath a bright Ohio sky washed clean by the previous night's rain. Brooks Auto Repair sat beside an old gas station on the edge of town, its faded blue sign gently swaying in the cool breeze while the familiar scent of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee drifting from a nearby diner. Ethan rolled open the garage door just after 8 o'clock, already wearing worn work gloves before the first customer arrived. He welcomed the quiet rhythm of ordinary life. Engines could be diagnosed. Loose belts could be tightened. Broken parts could be replaced. Hearts were never that simple. Around 9:30, a modest silver sedan pulled slowly into the parking lot. There were no security vehicles, no chauffeur, and no photographers. Victoria stepped out wearing blue. Jeans, white sneakers, and a light brown jacket that looked more comfortable than expensive. Her blonde hair rested loosely against her shoulders, untouched by the polished style that usually accompanied public appearances. She paused outside the garage for a moment, taking in the sound of tools clicking against metal and the easy conversations between neighbors waiting for repairs. For the first time in years, she stood somewhere nobody expected anything from her except honesty. Ethan looked up from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck and froze for just a second before offering the same gentle smile he had given her at the cafe. "Good morning," he said. "That is not the company limousine I expected." Victoria laughed quietly. "I thought this one might attract less attention." He wiped his hands on a clean shop towel and walked toward her. "What brings you here?" She held up a small paper bag from the local bakery. "Peace offering." Ethan looked inside and smiled. "Blueberry muffins. Your daughter inspired the choice." He could not help laughing. She would approve. Before either of them could say anything else, a cheerful voice echoed from inside the office. "Daddy, Mrs. Jenkins brought more cookies." Lily skipped into the garage, carrying a plastic container nearly half as wide as she was. She stopped when she noticed Victoria standing nearby. The little girl looked up with curious blue eyes before smiling politely. Victoria knelt slightly, so they were almost eye level. "Hello, Lily. I am Victoria." Lily studied her for a second before asking the question only a child would ask without hesitation. "Are you the lady from the dinner?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, slightly embarrassed. "Yes, sweetheart." Lily grinned. "I knew it." Victoria blinked in surprise. "You did." Lily nodded proudly. Daddy smiled when he came home, but it was a sad smile. That only happens when he meets somebody he likes but thinks he cannot have. Ethan closed his eyes briefly while Victoria covered her mouth to hide a laugh. "Children," Ethan said with quiet surrender, "have a remarkable talent for telling the truth." Lily reached into the cookie container and handed one to Victoria. "Mrs. Jenkins says homemade chocolate chip cookies make almost every problem smaller." Victoria accepted it as though it were the most valuable gift she had received all week. "Please tell Mrs. Jenkins that I believe she might be right." For the next hour, she remained at the garage without mentioning business, board meetings, or billion-dollar decisions. She simply watched Ethan patiently explain repairs to elderly customers without charging for tiny adjustments, saw him help an older gentleman carry groceries into his trunk before returning to finish an oil change, and noticed how every person leaving the shop smiled as though they had visited an old friend instead of a mechanic. There were no headlines celebrating this kindness. No awards waited on a shelf. No applause followed these quiet moments. Yet standing there beneath the morning sunlight filtering through the open garage door, Victoria finally understood what true success looked like. It was measured not by how many people worked for someone, but by how many people walked away feeling seen, respected, and cared for. And somewhere deep inside her heart, the invisible distance between a billionaire and a single father became just a little smaller. By Monday morning, the quiet visit to Brooks Auto Repair was no longer a secret. A customer had recognized Victoria, taken a harmless photograph of her laughing beside Ethan while Lily proudly held a blueberry muffin, and posted it online with a simple caption, "Our town's favorite mechanic just made a billionaire smile." Within hours, the image spread across business blogs and local news stations. Some people called it heartwarming. Others immediately invented stories that had never happened. Comment sections filled with assumptions. Some insisted Ethan was chasing wealth. Others claimed Victoria had lost her judgment. Neither opinion came from anyone who had spent even 5 minutes watching the way they had looked at one another. Ethan discovered the attention when 3 reporters parked outside his garage before sunrise. They asked polite questions, but cameras remained pointed toward every customer entering the shop. Ethan answered none of them. He simply unlocked the garage, greeted Mrs. Jenkins with his usual smile, and went back to replacing a worn alternator on an old family sedan. His work remained unchanged even if the world around him had become louder. During lunch, he received a phone call from Lily's elementary school. The principal spoke kindly, explaining that several parents had recognized the news coverage and reporters had already called asking whether they could photograph Ethan picking up his daughter after class. Ethan thanked her for protecting Lily's privacy before quietly ending the call. He rested both hands on the workbench and closed his eyes. This was exactly what he had feared. Across the city, Victoria walked into another executive meeting where the atmosphere felt colder than usual. Several board members exchanged cautious glances before the chairman finally cleared his throat. "There are concerns," he began carefully. "Investors are asking questions about the publicity." Another director slid a newspaper across the polished table. The photograph from the garage filled nearly half the front page of the business section. Beneath it appeared a headline suggesting the company's leader had become distracted by a relationship beneath her professional standing. Victoria read the words only once before folding the newspaper closed. "They are not concerned about the company," she said calmly. "They are concerned that I spent time with an honest man instead of another executive." The room fell silent. One senior board member adjusted his glasses before speaking. "With respect, public perception affects shareholder confidence." Victoria looked directly at him. "Does integrity no longer affect it?" No one answered. The silence lingered beneath the bright conference room lights until Daniel quietly placed a folder beside her. Inside were recommendations from public relations advisors suggesting she release a statement describing Ethan as nothing more than a casual acquaintance. Victoria stared at the page without moving. She remembered Ethan refusing to let her pay for his dinner. She remembered him worrying only about Lily. She remembered a little girl proudly sharing homemade cookies with a stranger. None of those memories belonged inside a carefully crafted public statement. She slowly closed the folder. "I will not reduce a good man's character to protect a headline." Back at the garage, Ethan was sweeping the floor after closing when he noticed a black sport utility vehicle parked quietly across the street. It did not approach. It simply waited for several minutes before driving away. He knew enough to realize the attention was growing, and with every passing hour his concern for Lily grew stronger. That evening, after tucking his daughter into bed, he stood alone on the front porch beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. He wondered whether walking away completely would be the kindest choice for everyone involved. At that very same moment, miles away, Victoria stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office looking over the city lights. She had spent years fighting for billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, yet the most important decision of her life had nothing to do with business. She picked up her phone, looked at Ethan's number for a long moment, then whispered to the empty room. "This time, I am not choosing power. I am choosing what is right." 2 days later, Sterling Dynamics announced an unexpected press conference. Financial reporters filled the auditorium expecting news of a major acquisition or a record-breaking investment, but the giant screen behind the stage remained blank. Victoria stepped onto the platform wearing a simple navy suit with no dramatic entrance and no prepared promotional video. The room settled into silence as cameras focused on her. She looked across the audience for a long moment before speaking. "For years," she began calmly, "people have measured my success by quarterly earnings, stock prices, and business growth. Those achievements matter, and I remain grateful for everyone who helped build this company. But today I want to speak about something far more valuable." Curious whispers spread through the room. Victoria continued without hesitation. "Last week, I met a man who repaired cars for a living. He did not know who I was, and for one beautiful evening, he treated me exactly the way every human being hopes to be treated. He listened without asking what I owned. He respected me without expecting anything in return. When he discovered my position, he did not ask for opportunities, introductions, or favors. Instead, he worried about protecting his little daughter from unnecessary attention." The room became perfectly still. That man reminded me that character cannot be purchased, kindness cannot be negotiated, and dignity cannot be listed on a balance sheet. She folded the prepared notes she had never needed. Some have suggested I distance myself from him to satisfy public opinion. I will not. If honesty creates uncomfortable headlines, then perhaps the headlines need to change. Across town, Ethan had placed his phone on silent while replacing the brakes on an old station wagon. He had no idea that customers gathering in the waiting area were watching the broadcast together on a television mounted near the coffee machine. Mrs. Jenkins wiped away a tear before quietly calling him inside. "Ethan," she said softly, "I think someone wants you to hear this." He removed his work gloves and stepped into the office just as Victoria finished speaking. She looked directly into the nearest camera, though her words seemed meant for only one person. "The strongest people I have ever met are not always the wealthiest or the most powerful. Sometimes they're single parents who quietly keep promises every single day without expecting applause. They remind us that respect should always come before status, and love should always begin with truth." Ethan stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the screen, while the waiting room remained completely silent. Nobody joked. Nobody whispered. They simply listened. That evening, just before sunset, another familiar silver sedan pulled into the driveway outside Ethan's small home. Victoria stepped out carrying nothing except a paper bag from the same neighborhood bakery. Lily opened the front door before Ethan could reach it. "You came back," the little girl said with a bright smile. "Victoria Nadith. I promised myself I would." Lily looked up at her father. "Can she stay for pancakes on Saturday?" Ethan and Victoria exchanged a quiet smile before he answered, "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea." Weeks later, life settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned but both quietly treasured. Reporters eventually found new stories to chase. Headlines disappeared. The cameras moved on. Yet every Saturday morning, inside a modest kitchen filled with the scent of blueberry pancakes and fresh coffee, three voices shared laughter around a worn wooden table, while colorful drawings slowly covered another refrigerator door. Victoria eventually found her watercolor brushes again. Ethan never stopped fixing cars. Lily never stopped believing that every good story deserved another chapter. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all. The richest woman in the room had finally discovered that the greatest fortune was never waiting inside a boardroom or a bank account. It had been waiting all along in the quiet heart of a good man who taught her that real love does not ask what you own. It simply asks whether you are willing to stay.